Hello, welcome to 8.9 News. I'm Ffinlo Costain. Scottish Land and Estates says that the Scottish Government's land reform bill is gambling with the future of communities in rural Scotland and with investment in the transition to net zero. Sarah-Jane Laing is the Chief Executive of Scottish Land and Estates. I asked her in what way the bill is gambling with the future of rural Scottish communities.
So land managers of all types and sizes in Scotland are making a significant contribution to delivering for the well-being of Scotland and Scotland's communities. Whether that's housing, whether it's addressing the climate and nature emergencies, or delivering the wealth of economic benefits to rural Scotland. Our viewpoint is that the measures which are going to be brought in during this bill will affect that delivery, especially the delivery of benefits at scale. We've seen the scale of land management, so those large land holdings the government would like to fragment and would like to target, are delivering the most in terms of renewables for housing, for climate and nature. So in reality, if you introduce a bill which either breaks up that scale or places disproportionate new obligations on those managers, it will disincentivize investment, and it will ultimately deliver less positive outcomes for people, jobs and nature across Scotland.
Let's drill into that, if I may. I wonder whether you're able to talk to me about what the Scottish Government is actually trying to achieve through its land reform agenda, whether you have a sense of its ultimate policy goal.
That's a really good question. So, and I think if the government was clearer about that, we might be having a kind of more constructive discussion, because for me, land reform is about delivering the best from the land that we have in Scotland, delivering for people, for jobs, for nature. Scottish Government wants to try and improve transparency of ownership, and we're all for that. They also want to increase opportunities for people to influence what's happening in Scotland's land. Now, they do seem to be focusing only on one area, which is the direct engagement with landowners about land management plans, rather than kind of dealing with the plethora of issues that we have in our planning system, the issues that we have with local democracy, all those kind of things that really give people a real stake in what happens in local areas. And the other thing that they want to do is what they call diversity of ownership. And I suppose that causes Scottish Land and Estates the biggest issue, because it's not diversity of ownership to deliver outcomes, because there's no evidence that actually happens. It's diversity of ownership for diversity's sake. So reducing the number of large land holdings, and where they can, breaking the large landownings that exist up at point of sale. So if that is the policy aim, then some of these measures will definitely do that. But what they won't do are deliver the positive outcomes that Scottish Government says it's trying to address at a macro level, more jobs, more opportunities, addressing the climate and nature emergencies.
So are there things that you support as much as there are things that you disagree with in terms of those social objectives? I mean, are there elements where you might find common ground with the government, or do you think that they're simply going about the whole thing in the wrong way?
So land reform is about much more than just this piece of legislation, and there's lots of things in the land reform arena that Scottish Land and Estates supports the government on, and in fact has been drivers of change. So transparency of ownership, being really clear about who owns land, but also who to contact if there are issues or opportunities that you want to discuss. So the work that's been done with Registers of Scotland to voluntarily register land in Scotland, to be very visible about what's happening. That's something that we're bought into. There's also loads of things happening in terms of good practice. So trying to inspire people across Scotland, both land managers of all types and sizes, but also people who have a stake to kind of work together. So great things happening on shared ventures, so long leases, negotiated sales, so willing seller transfers to land. That's happened for decades, if not centuries, in Scotland. So all those things that are happening are for us part of land reform, and there's some really great things happening in that sphere in terms of good practice. Where we differ is that Scottish Government has a tendency to want to go straight to intervention, to control, to land market interference. They also talk about what they call secret sales, which in reality are off-market property sales, which happen across the world. They're a fairly normal part of business, and indeed Scottish Government are active participants. They bought land off market themselves. We agree with Scottish Government that where a community has an interest and has registered an interest in a particular asset, that they shouldn't be thwarted if that exists. But what the Scottish Government is doing, as the Scottish Government often does, is use that, that terrible phrase, using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. There's maybe a few instances of this happening in Scotland over the last few years. But what they're going to do is bring in provisions that will affect every single landholding of over 1,000 hectares in Scotland, so that you will have to pre-notify community bodies, or through the Scottish ministers, if you even just want to sell a piece of garden ground to someone who lives locally. Now, I'm sure that's not what they intended, but in a way, I suppose that's you talked about them going about things in the wrong way. Sadly, that's often been the case when it comes to legislation in Scotland in the last few years.
When you talk about legislative sledgehammers, do you think that a lot of this is perhaps just political posturing to appeal to the SNP voter base? And if it is, how do you think that they could better deliver the social objectives behind the bill?
I think land reform as a label plays really, really well to a section of the electorate. I think as well, it's been disappointing. We often hear claims that land reform's about righting historical wrongs. I want to be part of a Scotland that develops policy and legislation which is about where we are right now and where we want to be, rather than looking backwards. So I think there's an element of posturing there. I do think that many of the cabinet ministers do want to create positive outcomes for Scotland, and it's where we often see this dichotomy between really positive discussions we're having about new housing. The 2 new towns in Scotland are being built by large landowners, private landowners. Renewable energy, over 50% of Scotland's renewable energy is generated on Scotland's estate. So we're having really positive discussions about those policy areas on one hand, and yet land reform still seems to be very core to the SNP on an ideological basis, rather than what would be delivered in terms of outcomes.
So in terms of thinking ahead, how do you think the land reform bill could, in its current form, affect nature recovery, net zero, and the growing market for natural capital delivery?
So again, a fantastic question, because I don't think that's been fully thought through. So if you look at those people who are looking to invest in forestry and natural capital, many of them are investing at scale. And one of the things that the investors want is certainty to kind of understand. So whether you're a pensions company, or you're investing in on behalf of other ethical investors, you need to know about what the long-term certainty of your land asset. The reality is that if you don't know whether or not the Scottish Government will then break that up, if you as an asset holder want to sell that on at any stage, then the certainty is gone. The risk is too high. So we know from speaking to a number of the natural capital investors in Scotland that their plans are on hold right now, because they have to look at this from a risk point of view. And their risk assessors are saying the Scottish ministers giving themselves powers to break up estates at a point of future sale is too high for some of these investors. So that's the money that we're trying to attract to Scotland. We want to see companies, we want to see natural capital investment happening. It's definitely not happening right now at the scale we want it to happen.
So obviously investors would probably prefer to have direct bilateral relationships with single estates, but are there examples of investors working with groups of smaller landowners working together at landscape scale?
Yeah, there's a couple. So there are a couple of sort of farm clusters and areas, but even those, I have to say, are made up of fairly substantive land holdings plus a few small ones. So that it's not just a kind of, everyone's under 100 hectares and they all come together. It's quite a mosaic of ownership, including large land holdings. And one of the most successful ones is up in Cairngorms, the Cairngorms Connect, so often lauded as, the most successful natural capital project going on. Those are really large-scale landowners that are involved in that. So I think even where those are happening at landscape scale, you still need individual scale within that as well. There's other smaller projects, some really good work happening with Riverwoods that's attracting money to fund riparian planting. But the big game changers, if I can kind of call it that, the real land use change, or the real restoration of nature, peatland restoration, the funding of tree planting. Most of that is happening with single landowners.
So in terms of this land reform bill, is your message to government that they simply need to go back to the drawing board, or are there ways that the bill can be amended to make it more workable?
Well, ironically, the Scottish Government, at the same time as they've brought this forward, have said they're going back to review the current legislation. So we already have a myriad of ways of communities accessing land. So that they cover 2 or 3 pieces of legislation over the last sort of 20 years. So the Scottish Government said they're going to review to see whether those are working properly, but not report until after this bill. Now, for me, that just doesn't seem a sensible way of developing good law. So what we're asking the Scottish Government to do is to pause and say, let's factor that into our thinking, because I actually believe that what we have in the statute, if it worked properly, could actually address some of the issues that people feel that this bill would address. So, for example, without getting too nerdy in terms of Scottish land reform, we already have a power on the statute book that if a landowner of any type or size is acting as a barrier to sustainable development in their local area, the Scottish ministers have powers to forcibly transfer that land. So we have that. So why on earth would you introduce another measure, which is lotting for the sustainable development of a local community? And you've got people, I think, from all across the I would sort of say the kind of land reform sphere, with very different views to Scottish Land and Estates, saying, as drafted, this seems overly bureaucratic and unworkable. So, the message to the Scottish Government is, you've not got this right. Let's not try and tinker with this. Let's not rush it through and then spend years unraveling it. Let's pause and let's bring forward something which is workable and will deliver the best outcomes for Scotland.
That was Sarah-Jane Laing from Scottish Land and Estates. More news on our website, 8.9.com. That's all for now. We're back soon. Thanks for watching.